In this video, we're going to discuss the mathematical capabilities of VBA. And as far as math is concerned, VBA is just as capable as Excel, if not more so. Rather than having huge formulas written into the formula bar in Excel, we can isolate the steps of large mathematical equations and use variables to break out the data in a way that makes sense intuitively. So I've outlined some of the main mathematical functions you'll use in VBA, and you can see you can do the typical math functions like addition, subtraction, division, and multiplication in VBA, and those are pretty straightforward. Just like you would do in Excel, you can simply use the plus sign, minus, slash, or asterisk to represent the function that you want to perform. So in this example column, we can see what we would type in Visual Basic, and in representation, we can see how we would normally write that function on paper. And so these match up pretty closely for our main functions here. Other functions aren't quite as intuitive. So when we start moving to exponents, we start to see that. So first we can have a general exponent, just using the caret here like you do in Excel, so that's pretty straightforward as well. But by using exponentials, which you might do in scientific fields or in engineering, you'll actually be typing exp and identifying the number as shown here. So exp1 is represented as this on paper. Same with the square root function. You'll type SQR with your number, and this would be the result of what that would look like. Absolute value, again, very similar. You type ABS for absolute, identify your number, and this is what that representation would look like. So again, this example column is what we type in VBA, and this is what that would actually represent on paper. We can also adjust numbers by rounding them or truncating the decimals entirely. So starting with round, we would first list the full number with all of the decimals and then tell the system how many decimals we want to round to. So in this example, we're trying to round the number 5.789 and we only want one decimal when we're done rounding it. Integer and fixed do similar things. They truncate the decimal from the number. The difference between the two is that integer will always push positive numbers towards 0, so a positive 2.4 would become 2, but it pushes negative numbers away from 0, so the negative 2.4 would become negative 3. Fix, on the other hand, always tends towards 0, regardless of whether the number is positive or negative, and we'll see an example of this in a second with this negative 2.4 that we're running both int and fix on. We can also randomly generate a number between 0 and 1 by using this random function, which is rnd open parentheses close parentheses. Since this only generates between 0 and 1, we have to do some math using this random function if we want to get a random number between our own lower and upper bounds, say between the numbers 1 and 6. And I've written this out for you over here. So you'll start by subtracting your lowest possible number from your upper number. So you'll want to replace this upper number with whatever your upper bound is and the lower number with whatever your lower bound is. Then you'll add 1, multiply that by your randomly generated number that's between 0 and 1, and you'll add back in your lower number as the last step, and that will randomly generate a number between your upper and your lower bounds. And you can break this formula down step by step in VBA to get a better idea of how it works. The last thing that we regularly do with VBA is to convert text strings into actual numbers that we can perform math with. If you have a string of text that you try to perform calculations with, VBA can occasionally error out or miscalculate, so it's best practice to perform mathematical functions on actual numbers, so data that has been stored as a number. So we can use this cint function to convert the text number, say we have a text string that is the number 4, and we can actually convert that into actual data number 4. So generally speaking, VBA can do everything Excel can do, and that includes basic trigonometry like sine, cosine, tangent, and pi, and basic financial or statistical functions. So just as an example, we'll go ahead and we'll take a look at each of these functions in VBA, but know that VBA is capable of doing any sort of math that Excel is capable of doing as well. So I'll go ahead and open this up, and we can see here I've pre-written this math manipulator code. So I'm going to half my screen like so and zoom out a little bit on this window. And I'll give you a second to pause and copy this if you want to run it yourself. Otherwise, I'll talk through this line by line and we'll give it a test run to see if our results end up as expected. So I'll give you a second to pause. So that should have been enough time to pause. So now I'm going to briefly talk through each of these lines one by one. So starting with this line here, all this is saying is that I want cell in row 3 and column 6. So in this case, if I come back to my worksheet here, we're going to go down to row 3 and come over to column 6, in this case F3. So we know this should probably represent our addition here, which is just 5 plus 4. There's nothing particularly fancy about that. The next is subtraction. Again, nothing fancy about this. Division. Again, nothing fancy about this. Multiplication. Nothing fancy. Exponent. Nothing fancy. Here's where we start to get into the a little bit more complicated section. So exp1 should be our exponential of 1. Our SQR should be our square root of 9. ABS of -1 means the absolute value of -1. And again, if you actually are in these parentheses and you hit space, these functions will tell you what their input should be. So for these three, you're just inputting a singular number that you want to run the function on. Now for round, if I come back into my parentheses and hit space, you can see we have two inputs this time. The first input is the number, and this is the number that we're trying to round. And the second input is the number of digits after the decimal. And so in this case, we've put 1, which means we want 1 digit after the decimal. Moving down into int, this is what we were talking about earlier, where int and fix are both very similar, but fix will always tend towards 0, whereas int will tend away from 0 when it's a negative number. And so what that means in this case, when we run this, we should expect that the result of fix here will be -2 because it tends towards 0, but the result of our int function here should be -3 because it should tend away from 0. Moving down again, I've created a variable here and I've told VBA this is a string type variable, so I fed it as a string the number 4. And normally if we have all of these string variables and we're trying to do math and perform math on these string variables, it can cause some problems in our code later on. So it's best practice to go ahead and use the cint function here whenever we reference this particular string. So instead of being a string of the number 4, so surrounded in quotes like it is here, it'll be a regular number 4 like we see anywhere else in our math here. And it should just be 4 plus 2, which again, nothing fancy, so we should see that performed correctly. So now I'll walk through this line by line, and I'll do that by using either debug step into or just using the F8 shortcut on your keyboard. So make sure you're clicked into the subroutine and go ahead and press F8. So we can see we're about to start running this sub. The first thing we should see is the addition result, which is 9, so that checks out with what we would expect. Second would be our subtraction, -6, which is what we would expect. The next will be our division, our multiplication, our exponent, now our exponential of 1, our square root of 9, our absolute value of -1, and now we're getting into our rounding here, so we should see this 5.789 rounded to 1 decimal place. So that checks out. We should see our -2.4 truncated the decimal, but in this case trending away from 0 since it's int and it's a negative number. So we see that results in -3. For fix, we should see it tend towards 0 since fix always tends towards 0, so we should see -2. And in this particular cell here, we should see just a random number between 0 and 1. So that checks out. Now at the end here, we've created this variable c. We've fed it the number 4, but as a string and not as an actual integer. So we're going to convert that to an integer here and perform some simple math. And that checks out. So hit F8 one more time to end your code. So in this video, we talked about the main mathematical functions that you might use in VBA, and we gave examples of some of those functions. So now we should be able to perform more complex math work within VBA itself. Just keep in mind that VBA can do things like sine, cosine, tangent. It does recognize the value of pi. It can do basic financial, basic statistical math like you would in Excel usually. So anything you can do in Excel, you can convert over to Visual Basic. And a good way to do that would be to go ahead and record a macro or use the object library to find the matching function.